Hello there guys and welcome back to FATBOSS TV. Today we're looking at another encounter from the Eternal Palace with the fourth boss, Lady Ashvane. So this is our personal favourite in the instance up to this point. This two-phase encounter is all about maximising boss damage to keep incoming raid damage to survivable levels during phase 1, whilst in phase 2 you need to clear up the room removing coral fragments that spawn throughout phase 1. Anyway, let's kick straight into it by showing how phase 1 plays out. So first to mention is tank positioning. Throughout the fight she'll mark tanks with Barnacle Bash. This deals a large amount of physical damage and increases the damage you take from that hit by 150% for 35 seconds, so you'll want to tank swap after each hit. This also leaves behind a large patch of sharp coral that deals a large amount of damage to anyone who stands within it. You want to slowly move the boss around the edges of the room as these spawn, however you may also need to move because of the coral growths. These spawn randomly throughout the room on a timer, dealing a burst of damage to anyone that's within their landing zone. These coral formations will remain stationary throughout the fight. When the boss casts Rippling Wave, every coral growth will spawn a bubble that will begin to travel towards the boss. If they reach her, they'll effectively heal her and deal raid-wide damage. These bubbles can however be soaked by players, dealing raid-wide damage but also debuffing the player of waterlogged. This is a stacking dot with a lengthy duration. So as a tank you want to position the boss so that there is a good distance between her and any coral growths. This will allow enough time for players to soak bubbles, with enough downtime in between each soak for healers to top the incoming raid damage. When soaking, we found going above 2 or 3 stacks was pretty dangerous, so you want to rotate different players each time. The bubbles come in every 30 to 40 seconds or so, and as more coral growths spawn, the more you'll have to soak, to the point where it's no longer really manageable. The only way to stop the growths from spawning is by entering phase 2, which is done by destroying the boss's carapace. This is displayed as a large absorption shield equal to 40% of her maximum health, and this is why you need a lot of damage. You gotta break her shield before the phase becomes unhealable.
Now whilst all of that is going on, you need to watch out for the upsurge circles. These deal a massive amount of damage and will knock you high into the air of your court. You've just got to be quick to avoid them, especially when bubbles are being soaked. Last to mention is the Briny Bubble. This debuff is applied to 3 members of your raid, including one of your tanks. When the debuff times out, it will cause all players within the targeting circle around each debuff player to be encased in a bubble, which will incapacitate them until the bubble is destroyed. Players that are bubbled will also take moderate ticking damage. On our Heroic and Mythic testing, we tried to stack these players so the bubbles could just be cleaved down. However, on our normal mode, which was the most recent test, the debuff had no targeting circle around it and only applied to the player. Yet in the dungeon journal it suggests that it will still encase other players within 12 yards. So how it will work on live servers, we're still not quite sure. Regardless, you'll want to free the players as soon as possible, focusing primarily on the tank. And once you've got the hang of dealing with all of those mechanics and destroyed the boss's absorb shield, you'll enter phase 2.
Now at this point the boss will begin to actually take damage, while she deals small bursts of damage to random players. She will continue to spawn upsurge circles and debuff players with Briny Bubble, but the corals will not be prompted to spawn bubbles. Instead she'll debuff 3 pairs of players with Arcing Azurite. This creates markers above the player's head with pairs matching. After 8 seconds, a beam is sent between the matching marks, dealing damage to the debuff players as well as anyone in between them. This beam will also one-shot any coral growths, so the moment the debuffs come out, you need to identify where your matching mark is and stand in such a way that maximises the amount of coral that you destroy, while simultaneously dodging any of the beams from opposite marks. If done correctly throughout the phase, you can destroy all of the coral formations before you re-enter phase 1 for a second time, and if you don't manage to do this, you'll go into phase 1 already behind. Ultimately this could lead to a wipe later on down the line as you fall behind on the bubble soaking damage. Anyway, after you've been in phase 2 for around 60 seconds, she'll re-enter phase 1 and the fight repeats. However, what we've failed to mention so far is that each time she reapplies a new carapace, it's 150% larger than the previous. This makes phase 1 much longer each time you enter it, which seems to be the pseudo-enrage of the fight. And based on the testing we've done so far on all 3 difficulties, it seems likely that they expect you to do phase 1 3 times, killing the boss in the 3rd phase too. As for the mythic version of this fight, it adds an additional larger bubble each time that the growths are prompted. This requires multiple soaks to remove, which just generally increases incoming raid damage by a shitload, and the waterlogged debuff that it leaves on you is permanent, so you actually have to get everyone involved. During phase 2, whenever a coral growth is laser beamed, it'll attempt to respawn multiple versions of itself in targeting zones 5 seconds later, which you need to soak. So yeah, this fight on Mythic could potentially be the first block in the instance based on its tuning, which on PTR was absolutely nuts. But either way, before we end the video, what do we think?
So it's easily the best fight in here up to this point, and if the last two weren't so good, it would probably be the best in the instance. It's really fun to DPS because you need to be on top of your game and burst the boss down as fast as you can while swapping to bubbles and soaking if it's required of you. It's really fun to heal because, well, there's a shitload to heal, and it's all predictable damage on timers. And I'd say it's probably also quite fun to tank because you need to play a constant minigame of moving from the patches underneath you, whilst also taking into account the distance between the boss and new coral growths. A few things we should mention about the fight that we're not totally sure on though is the patches on Heroic and Mythic, they never despawned, whereas on normal they despawned after a certain amount of time. If that's intended, then potentially the enrage on the fight isn't so much to deal with phase 1 length, but actually the remaining space in the room. And this is even more unclear because on some of the tests you could stack the patches, whereas on others you could actually overlap them slightly. Hopefully it doesn't come down to a lack of space wiping you though, as the idea, of coral overwhelming you is far more interesting, and at least something that you can control to a certain extent. But aside from that, I think it's only praise that we have for this fight.
Yeah, it's all relatively easy to understand, and it's, as you said, pretty fun from all role aspects. And mainly, I'm just worried about tuning, because it could be a really decent mythic boss, but if they get the tuning wrong, it could turn into a massive brick wall on week 1, and that'll just lead to another fetid situation where everyone's just like, oh god.
Yeah.
This boss is terrible. And the thing is, you can't go and choose another boss after this one. This one, it blocks the 5th boss. So you have to kill her first. So hopefully they get the tuning right, where it's still challenging, but it's not a huge wall. But either way, guys, that's where we're going to leave it today. Thank you very much for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with this boss, ready to kill it immediately once it hits live servers, then go check out our written work over on Wowhead. A link for that can be found in the description below. Also, expect a live guide to hit the channel as soon as we kill her in Heroic Week. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.
Catch you later.